He had run the orchard for 22 years without writing a single thing down, and he was proud of that. I want to be clear about something before I tell you this story. Pride is not always a bad thing. A man who knows his land, who has worked it through drought and late frost and the kind of August heat that turns the grass to paper, that man has earned something. What he has not necessarily earned is the right to be wrong about it. This is the story of Emmett Burrell and the week a woman named Clara Stowe came to stay. Emmett Burrell was 41 years old when his older brother Hank died of a heart attack in early March, between the breakfast table and the back door, with his coat half on and one boot still in his hand. Hank had owned a third of the Burrell orchard outright. 60 acres of apple, pear and cherry trees in the hill country of eastern Tennessee, along a road that most maps still didn't bother to name. Their father had planted the first rows in 1961. Their grandfather had cleared the slope before that. The land had never belonged to anyone outside the family. Until now Hank had never married, he had no children. What he had, it turned out, was a will that nobody knew about, drawn up quietly 3 years prior with a lawyer in town, and in that will he had left his third of the orchard to a woman named Clara Stowe. Emmett found out on a Wednesday. He did not speak for the rest of that day. Clara Stowe was 36 years old, lived in Knoxville and worked as a financial analyst for a firm that managed agricultural land portfolios across the Southeast. She was not, as Emmett assumed when he first heard about her, some distant relation of Hank's who had turned up for the inheritance. She was the daughter of a woman Hank had loved quietly for most of his adult life, a woman named June Stowe who had died 2 years before Hank, and whose memory Hank had apparently honored by making sure her daughter was taken care of. Emmett had not known about June, he had not known about any of it. 22 years of working side by side with his brother. And there was a whole life Hank had kept to himself. Clara called the following Monday. She was polite. She said she understood this was difficult. She said she had no intention of disrupting anything, but that she did want to come out and see the property. Emmett said that was fine. He said it in a tone that made clear it was not fine. Clara came anyway that Friday. In a gray truck she drove herself with a leather folder under her arm and a pair of boots that were not new. He met her at the end of the gravel drive. She was shorter than he expected. She looked at the trees and then she looked at him and she said, "Thank you for having me." He said, "I didn't have much choice." She said, "No, I suppose you didn't." And she didn't seem bothered by that at all, which bothered him considerably. The farmhouse had a screened porch that looked out over the lower rows of apple trees. And that is where Emmett took Clara first, because it was the most impressive part of the property, and he was not above wanting to impress her even while resenting her presence. The trees were old. They had good structure. The lower slope caught morning light well, and even in March before the bloom, you could see the care that had gone into pruning them. She looked at all of it and said nothing for a while. Then she said, "How many trees are you running right now?" He told her. Around 1,100 across the 3 varieties, plus a small block of peach he had put in himself 8 years ago. She wrote something down. "And your yield last year per tree on the apples?" He told her what he figured. She looked at him then, not unkindly. "You figured, or you measured?" He said he knew his trees. She nodded slowly as if this were exactly the answer she had expected, and wrote something else down. He watched her hand move across the page and felt something tighten in his chest. That evening she asked if she could look at the books. He said there weren't really books. There were receipts mostly in a box in the mudroom, and a spiral notebook where he'd written down spray dates and harvest totals, going back about 6 years. Before that it was in his head. Clara stood in the mudroom with the box open in front of her and looked at the receipts for a long time without saying anything. Then she said quietly, more to herself than to him, "Okay, all right," and she took the box and the notebook to the kitchen table and she worked until past midnight. Emmett went to bed. He lay in the dark and listened to the faint sound of paper moving and thought about his brother, who had known this woman's mother, who had loved her apparently, and never said a word. By Saturday morning she had found 3 things. She came to the breakfast table with the notebook and a yellow legal pad covered in her own writing, and she set it all down and poured herself a cup of coffee and sat. He stood by the window. He did not offer to sit with her. "Your spray program," she said, "is running you about 40% more than it needs to. You're using a calendar schedule. You could drop to a threshold-based system and save somewhere between $8,000 and $12,000 a year depending on the season." He said he had always done it that way. "I know," she said. "Your father did it that way too based on the receipts. But the inputs have changed. The chemistry's different. The timing models are better now." He said nothing. "Your packing shed contract," she said, turning a page on the legal pad. "You're paying a percentage rate that was reasonable in 2009. I looked it up last night. The going rate in this region for your volume is about 2 points lower. That's not nothing. Roy at the shed has packed my fruit for 15 years, Emmett said. "I'm not saying to leave Roy," she said. "I'm saying to renegotiate. He's probably not going to argue. He doesn't want to lose you." She turned another page. "And your peach block," she said, "is losing money." That was the one that landed differently. He had put those trees in himself. He had chosen the variety, prepped the ground, staked every sapling. He had thought of them as something extra, a thing he'd built on his own, apart from what his father had left him. He said, "The peaches had a bad year." "They've had 4 bad years," she said. She turned the notebook toward him and showed him the numbers he himself had written down. "The block isn't well sitted. You've got a frost pocket on that north edge. I walked it this morning before you were up." He stared at the numbers for a moment. He knew they were right. He had known, somewhere in the back of his mind, that the peaches were not what he'd hoped. But knowing a thing and having a stranger lay it flat on your kitchen table are 2 different experiences. He said, "You walked my land before you asked. I own a third of it," she said. She said it without edge, without triumph. Just a fact. And somehow that was worse than if she'd been unkind about it. He drove out to the back of the property that afternoon alone. He did this sometimes when he needed to think. Took the old farm road up past the cherry block, to where the land flattened out near the old spring house. His father used to come up here too. Emmett could remember being a boy and watching his father stand at the edge of that flat, and look out over the valley below. The full length of the orchard visible from there, row after row after row. He thought about what it meant to know a place. He thought he knew this one. He had been here every day of his adult life, had watched the trees through every season, had made every decision about this land with his own hands and his own mind. And then a woman he had never met had spent one night with a box of receipts and a spiral notebook, and had found in 8 hours things he had not seen in 8 years. The spray program, he knew, was probably right. He had wondered about it himself but had never pushed past the wondering. The shed contract. Yes. Roy was a friend, but business was business, and he had let friendship make him sloppy. The peaches he could not think about clearly yet. What he kept coming back to, up there by the spring house, was the question of why he hadn't done any of it himself. He had the same receipts. He had the notebook. The numbers were his own handwriting. He had simply never sat down and looked at them the way she had. Never held them up against anything. Never asked what they were telling him. He had been too busy being a man who knew his orchard to notice what his orchard was actually saying. That evening he came back in and she was still at the table working. She had a laptop open now and a set of county extension records pulled up on the screen, something about soil composition and rootstock compatibility. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He said, "Did Hank know you do this kind of work?" She looked up. "He did, we talked about it sometimes. He never told me." "No," she said, "he wouldn't have." He sat down across from her. This was the first time he had sat at the table with her and they were both aware of it. "Why'd he leave you the share?" Emmett asked. Straight answer. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I think he felt he owed my mother something. She never asked him for anything my whole life. He loved her for a long time, and she was practical about it, and he respected that, and when she died he didn't know what to do with that respect. So he put it somewhere." She paused. "I think he also thought I could be useful here. He could have told me." "He could have," she said. "He didn't. That's a separate thing from what we're dealing with now." He looked at the table, then he said, "The spray schedule. What would you actually change?" She turned the laptop toward him and walked him through it. He asked questions, real ones. She answered them straight, without condescension, without the faint performance of patience that people sometimes used when they thought they were talking to someone slower than them. She just talked. He just listened. It went on for 2 hours. Sunday she asked if she could walk the upper block with him. He said yes. They went out after breakfast, when the air was still cold and the light was flat and white. The upper block was the oldest part of the orchard. Trees his grandfather had planted in the 40s, some of them still bearing if you kept after them properly. He had always felt something particular up here, something he couldn't have put into words, a feeling that was less like pride and more like obligation. These trees were older than he was. They would outlast him if he was careful. Clara walked slowly. She looked at the bark, at the crotch angles, at the way the scaffolding had gone on trees that were 70 and 80 years old. "Your grandfather knew what he was doing," she said. "Yes," Emmett said. "He did. There's a row on the east end that might need a structural assessment. A few of those crotch angles are tight, but the rest of them are carrying well." She was not wrong about the east row. He had noticed it last season and noted it in the spiral notebook and then had not gone back to it. She stopped in front of one of the oldest trees, a northern spy that his grandfather had put in before the war. The trunk was wide and dark, and the limbs came off it in the kind of long considered reach that only happens when a tree has been pruned correctly for decades. "How much of this did you do yourself?" she asked. "All of it," he said. "The last 22 years. She nodded. She looked at the tree for a little longer, then she said, "It's good work, Emmett. Not for someone who doesn't keep records. Not considering you don't know your yield per tree. Just, it's good work." He looked at the tree with her. He said, "Thank you." The conversation about the peach block happened on Monday evening. He brought it up himself. He had thought about it all of Sunday and into the morning, and he had gone out and walked the block again alone. And he had looked at the north edge and he had seen, really seen this time. The way the cold air pooled there on still nights. He had known it was a frost pocket. He had planted there anyway, because it was his own piece and he had wanted it to work. He came in and sat at the table and told her what he'd seen. She listened. He said, "What'd you do with it?" She said. "Honestly, I'd pull the block and put in a cover crop for 2 seasons, rest the ground. Then look at a late-season apple variety that can tolerate the frost risk. Something with commercial potential but a longer hang time. Let the packing volume give you more room to negotiate with Roy." He was quiet for a moment. "That's probably right," he said. "You don't have to do it tomorrow," she said. "I know," he said. "But I'll probably do it." She smiled then for the first time in a real way, not politely but genuinely. It changed her face. He noticed that. On Tuesday morning she packed her truck. She was driving back to Knoxville for a work commitment, but would return in 3 weeks to talk through the management plan she was putting together for the property. She had ideas about how to structure the shared ownership going forward, a formal operating agreement, clear decision rights, a reporting structure that would satisfy both of them. She explained this at the kitchen door while he held her coffee cup, because she had forgotten it on the counter and he had picked it up without thinking. He handed it to her. She put it in her bag and said, "I know this wasn't what you expected." "No," he said. "I'm not trying to take anything from you," she said. "This place matters. You can see that in every row of it." He looked out past her at the orchard. The morning light was in the upper trees now, that particular angle that happened in March right before the buds, when the whole place looked like it was about to say something. "Hank was a quiet man," Emmett said finally. "He kept a lot to himself. I'm still deciding how I feel about that." "You've got time," she said. 3 weeks, he said. She almost laughed. "Not quite. 3 weeks," she agreed. She drove away down the gravel road, and he stood on the porch and watched the truck, until it turned off onto the main road, and was gone. Then he went inside and sat at the kitchen table. The same table he had sat at with his father and with Hank, and now with her. And he opened the spiral notebook and found the page about the peach block and read what he had written there 2 seasons ago. He had written, "North edge, cold air, watch this." He had watched it. He had not done anything about it. He closed the notebook. He thought about the difference between noticing and knowing. Between knowing and acting. About how easy it is to keep doing things the old way, not because the old way is right, but because stopping to question it feels like a kind of betrayal. Of the land, of the men who worked it before you, of everything you've built your understanding of yourself around. He thought about his brother who had loved a woman quietly for years and kept it to himself. Not out of dishonesty, but out of the same careful pride that runs through the Burrell men like a vein through stone. Hold it in. Don't make a fuss. Know your own land and tend it. What the land needed, it turned out, was a fresh set of eyes. When Clara Stowe came back 3 weeks later, she brought a draft operating agreement and a soil analysis she'd commissioned from the extension office, and a variety of late-season apple called a Gold Rush that she thought might do well in the former peach block. He had coffee ready. He had also, in those 3 weeks, renegotiated the packing shed contract with Roy, who had agreed to the new rate without a single argument, and had even seemed relieved to have it off the table. They sat at the kitchen table and went through the agreement page by page. He had questions. She had answers, and when she didn't have one she said so and wrote it down to find out. He liked that about her. He had liked it since the beginning, if he was honest, even when he hadn't wanted to. By the end of that second visit, and the several that followed through the spring, something had shifted between them that was harder to name than the spray schedule or the contract or the operating agreement. He was not a man who moved quickly toward anything. She was not a woman who pushed, but the orchard has a way of doing things to people who pay attention to it. It puts you in the same light at the same hour. It makes you watch the same things and notice them together, and after a while the distance between 2 people standing in an old apple block in the early morning starts to feel like something that needs tending to, same as any other part of the place. He asked her, in June, if she would consider staying more than 3 weeks at a time. She said she would consider it. She did more than consider it. By the following March, a full year after she'd first driven down that gravel road with her leather folder and her boots, she was living in the farmhouse full-time, running the financial side of the operation while he ran the land, and the two of them argued about decisions the way people argue when they both care about the same thing, and have enough respect for each other to say so out loud. The orchard did better that first full year than it had done in 6. The spray program ran at a third of the old cost. The late-season apples went into the former peach ground in the fall. And though they wouldn't bear for another 3 years yet, the block already looked right in a way the peaches never had. Roy at the packing shed told a man at the feed store that Emmett Burrell had gotten himself a good partner. The man at the feed store, who had known Emmett for 30 years, said he hadn't thought that was possible. He wasn't wrong about that either. But here it is. I think about Hank sometimes, and what he knew that he didn't say. He knew his brother was stubborn. He knew the orchard needed more than one kind of knowledge to survive, and he knew a woman who had more of that knowledge than most. He put those things together in a document and signed his name to it, and trusted the rest to time. That is one way of being generous. It is not the only way. But for a quiet man with a quiet life, it was the one he had. The orchard is still in the family. The trees in the upper block are still bearing. The crotch angles on the east row were addressed, one by one, over the course of that first spring, and the row is sounder for it. And there is something I want to ask you before you go. Because I think you already know the answer. Even if you haven't looked at it lately. What is the thing you already know needs changing? The thing you've written down and closed the notebook on? The thing you've noticed and not acted on? And what would it take for you to do something about it before someone else has to point it out for you? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone.